So I'd like to now welcome Jay Freeman, our first speaker, an award-winning urban planner specializing in housing and renewal. In 2008, Jay supported the preparation of Edmonton's 10-year plan to end homelessness, and in 2009 became the executive director of the Homeless Commission. Since 2014, Jay has served as the executive director for housing and homelessness for the city of Edmonton. He was the past chair of the Edmonton Joint Planning Committee on Housing and past chair of the Alberta Real Estate Foundation. A Roof Award recipient, a C-SPAN of Honor, and a recipient of the Reverend Marilyn McClung Memorial Award for Ecumenism. As ECHO, we would like to acknowledge Jay's long service as a public servant and housing advocate. And we should mention that he spoke at Edmonton's first National Housing Day rally in 1999. And we'd like to wish him well in his retirement. So thank you, Jay.
Thanks, Laura. You just reminded everybody how old I am. I also noticed that Laura is obviously much younger than me, because she's using her cell phone. I'm using, old school, some notes here. And it's interesting, I was just saying to Jim, I didn't find my 1999 speech, but I did find my 2001 speech to the National Housing Day ceremony back then. I want to begin with the right to housing. So the right to adequate housing is codified as a human right in the United Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25 to be specific, of which of course Canada is a signatory. National Housing Act 1973. Wow, that's going back, right? 44 years ago. This is what the then Honorable Ron Bassford, Federal Housing Minister, and by the way, our last Federal Housing Minister, said about housing. He said, "Good housing at a reasonable cost is a social right of every citizen of this country. This must be our objective, our obligation, and our goal." And over the next 20 years, 600,000 units of good quality, healthy, and affordable housing was built through our nonprofits, through our social housing agencies, cooperatives. So we know it can be done. C.D. Howe Institute has said the provision of affordable housing is a basic pillar of a civilized community. And the TD Bank, another right-wing organization, said, "Housing is a necessity of life, yet 1 in 5 households in Canada is still unable to afford acceptable shelter." And here locally, the City of Edmonton has said that access to safe, adequate, and affordable housing is fundamental to the physical, economic, and social well-being of individuals, families, and indeed whole communities. Sorry, my hands aren't working. And lastly, Jimmy Carter said, "The measure of society is found in how they treat their weakest and most helpless citizens." Yet, 35,000 Canadians are homeless on any given night in this country. And over 235,000 Canadians experience homelessness in a year. Put that in perspective locally, we now know that about 13,000 Edmontonians experience homelessness in a given year. But for those of you over the age of 40, you don't have to put your hand up. You'll remember a time when, sure, we had homelessness, but we did not have the mass homelessness that we see today on our streets and in our shelters. So I'd say to you, homelessness is a man-made problem. And in fact, I think you can draw a straight line between two policy decisions, both of government. First was by the federal government ceasing to build any social housing in this country since 1993. And the second, this was a provincial decision, but was largely called deinstitutionalization. Deinstitutionalization was not the problem. The problem was we deinstitutionalized without adequate, suitable housing and supports for those individuals. So if you think, I truly believe that those two factors, plus our worsening situation on our reserves, and so our Indigenous population is voting with their feet and moving to the cities, I think those factors largely have resulted in the situation we have today. So I mentioned I spoke at the 2001 National Housing Day. Back then I was utilizing the 1996 long census. And in 1996, Edmonton had over 45,000 households that were spending more than 30% of their gross household income on rent. What's even more remarkable, this is 1996 again, almost 21,000 were paying more than 50% of their gross household income on rent. Now let's move forward 15 years. 2011, we now had over 47,000 Edmonton households living, or paying, more than 30% of their gross household income on rent. And almost 25,000 Edmontonians spending more than 50% of their gross household income on rent. Now think about that. Frankly, if I had to spend 50% of my gross salary, meaning before taxes, it'd hurt, but I could still survive. I could still put food on the table for my family. I could still send my kids to school and the extracurricular activities. If you're low income and you're spending 50% of that, your gross household income, on rent, or more, in some cases, much more, something's got to give. And unfortunately, it usually ends up being food. And not surprisingly, we've seen again an increase in usage of our food bank. Also reported back in 2011 was on the, we saw homelessness on the rise. Sorry, 2001 I was reporting that, excuse me. I also remarked, and as I said, I found my remarks from that day. I also remarked in 2001 that the need to act is now. Well, again, that was 2001. I'm delighted to hear that our Prime Minister, and I think it's significant that it was the Prime Minister that released the National Housing Strategy today. That, after 44 years after the 1973 National Housing Act, we now have a National Housing Strategy. So, thank you, federal government. And what little I've seen of the details, it sounds to me as if the federal government listened when they consulted with Canadians. And there's much of what we were asking for in that strategy. But one of the things that's absolutely imperative, it was imperative in 01, it's imperative today. It's great that we now have a National Housing Strategy. It's great that the federal government has announced $11.2 billion over the next 11 years. But we need to get that money out the door, and we need to get that money out of the door now. And I'd also say, I think it's important that those monies be delivered to municipalities, to communities. I think this community can be very proud of the fact that we have for many years worked in collaboration. We have a very robust nonprofit housing sector, and as you've heard, ECOHH is celebrating its 30th year in existence. So we have a long history of working together, and more importantly, getting things done. In another presentation that I uncovered in preparing my notes for this, it was a presentation to the John Humphreys Center in 2007. In deference to David Letterman, I had my top 10 list of what needed to happen. Number 10 was create a national and provincial housing strategy. Well, as I've just said, as of today, we have a national housing strategy. We have a provincial housing strategy, and we have a municipal housing strategy. Number 9 was all 3 orders of government, and I really should have said all 4 orders of government, working together. For too long, it was like the old Abbott and Costello routine, who's on first. I'm not saying that we've got it all worked out, but I'm delighted to see better and cooperation amongst all of us. Number 8 was to provide adequate support services. You know, we've made tremendous success with our 10-year plan to end homelessness, housing over 6,600 people that have made the journey from homelessness to home. But it's critical that we understand that it's housing first, not housing only. We need those supports in place in order for people to succeed and retain their housing. Number 7 was deal with NIMBYism. And I think that is as true in 2007 as it is today, a decade later. Administration took forward a report to council a couple of months ago where we said what we need to be building, striving for, is inclusive, diverse, complete communities with a range of housing choices. And again, I think that's absolutely critical. And I do believe Edmontonians are ready for that. We've done some recent polling, and somewhat surprisingly to me anyways, was people are still addressing homelessness as one of their top priorities. Number 6 was we have to bust the myth that the homeless choose to be homeless. That one actually makes the hair on the back of my neck rise when I hear that. Nobody chooses to be homeless. At least it's able to make an informed choice. Number 5 was we need to engage the private sector. And that might sound odd coming from a public servant, but we have to remember that the private sector does deliver housing that is affordable to 80% of Edmontonian households. We don't want to screw that up, right? So they have to be part of the picture. Number 4 was we have to continue to build community capacity. As I said earlier, we've been successful in my mind largely because we've collaborated. And it hasn't been the city of Edmonton trying to run the show or the province run the show. It's largely we've worked with a nonprofit sector. And but there is a need to grow that capacity in the community. Number 3 was involve the Indigenous community in a real and meaningful way. Again, I think we've made some important progress, but we've got a long ways to go. Number 2 was build inclusive communities. Instead of NIMBYism, I want to hear, won't you be my neighbor? And lastly, and on this one, regrettably, we still are in need of this, we need to establish dedicated, sustainable funding for the creation of more affordable housing. So as delighted as I am, and I am truly delighted to hear about the National Housing Strategy, that's still government grants. Right? What we need is a dedicated, sustained source of funding. So when governments change or economic times change, there's still funding for affordable housing. So we never take our foot off the gas. I also said earlier that I think cities are critical. Cities, communities are critical to the delivery. The problems of homelessness are most evident in our big cities. And I think big cities need to be an equal partner in solving the problem. I think I'm proud of the City of Edmonton's leadership, for example, in developing our initial 10-year plan, or our Cornerstones plan, and more recently our affordable housing strategy. But we need to continue to be at the table. And to repeat myself, collaboration is key. I can't say that enough. And a great quote, I think, that I've stole from others, is collaboration moves at the speed of trust. And so I think it's really important that we are working together in a meaningful way and respectful way. Let me leave you with this quote from Winston Churchill. We shape our buildings, the buildings shape us. In other words, where we live really defines who we are. Thank you.